I guess I tried to use it as an opportunity to develop a project that would be, for want of a better word, a documentary. I might just read an introduction to it because it condenses the ideas of the project and we can get through that in a shorter time frame. So this is just really an introduction to, and the way I've formatted this is in a kind of a, as Fiona said, it's a treatment, so it's really been, in a way, it's formatted for an application to try and get some more funding together for the project. So Through the River is a documentary portrait of the Shoalhaven River, told through the people who have made it their place. The river itself narrates our story through characters it knows intimately. So the idea was to try and find a way, and I sort of happened through conversation with Fiona, to tell the story of the river, but not through. I didn't really want to privilege any particular one perspective of it. So instead of having, say, perhaps a local person narrate the story, the idea is that the river itself would narrate its own story. So that would be this sort of narrator. So these individuals have struggled to tame the Shoalhaven's unpredictable forces for the greater good. In our documentary, the river reveals different sides of itself. We see its generosity through the gift of water, food and shelter. This river offers sanctuary to our characters, providing a place for quiet reflection, where their own unique spiritualities can blossom. Over time, however, the river has grown weary, as many of its residents have not looked after it well enough. Here we see another side of the river, one that can be cruel and at times revolt in flooding. The river has grown weary, as many of its residents have not looked after it well enough. Here we see another side of the river, one that can be cruel and at times revolt in flooding. The river shows us how it has humbled our characters, how it engenders a sense of equality between the people who use it, whether recreationally or commercially. So in the last set of interviews I did, one of the features that people talked about in terms of what they valued about the river, especially a lot of the people that used the ski and wake park, was that it sort of, people would come from a whole bunch of different places, but when they came here, those structures or hierarchies that perhaps existed in their lives outside of coming here were levelled through their experience of the river or through their use of the river. So at the same time the river brings people together, it can also push them apart. We witness our characters in conflict as they try to manage this finite resource while struggling to identify what the river really needs to sustain itself. Through the River is a story built from emotions that breed in pockets of nature, personal struggles enveloped by the landscape, and memories that float across the river or the water. Intimacy, resistance, resolutions, and inevitable change attend these passages between people through their landscape. Like placing pins into a map and then drawing connections between them, Through the River is a psychogeography that imbricates these river stories into a singular narrative of the Shoalhaven, the river itself as a living, breathing and changing entity. And the idea would be that the river, so the story at the moment begins just up at Tallowa Dam and then moves through past Bundanon and Riversdale through to Greenwell Point to where it meets the ocean. And so that basic structure of the river kind of, well, the narrative is built on that. Okay, so it sort of, I guess, creates a parameter in a way to tell the story. So it's quite, I guess, logical in terms of how those stories unfold through the geography of the river as you just move down that way. So the stories of characters we meet along the way provide a variety of lenses that articulate very different relationships to this same river. These narratives sometimes collude, but they often overlap in incongruous ways, ricocheting off one another, generating friction. Through the River bears witness to the complexity of placemaking along the Shoalhaven, building a rich scaffolding across this riverscape and delivering a pertinent portrait of this place and the people who have made it. So what I've tried to do with the documentary is try and figure out the ways in which the story was going to be told. And I guess there are three treatments, I guess, in terms of how I've been thinking about trying to tell the story. And the first one I think I've already mentioned, which is the idea of the river as the narrator itself, that tells the story of the Shoalhaven, but also enables those different perspectives to surface at the same time, sometimes coming together, sometimes falling apart. So it's sort of like a polyvocal narrative. So and this was a conversation that we had, that it wasn't the river that was polyvocal, it was more that it was a device to introduce these different characters, so that those different kind of voices could be heard. And I guess also it enabled us to, or it enables the documentary to travel through time. So you can introduce characters that perhaps are no longer alive, that once had a relationship to the river, that don't anymore. And so those multiple times will come through the documentary, but not necessarily in a chronological order. So you might meet a character. One of the people that I think Jim talked about was Louisa Atkinson, who didn't spend a lot of time here, but was she was a botanist and an artist and a drawer. So the way in which it would work was that you might be travelling along the river, and these characters you would kind of come across doing things rather than saying things in the river. And that's the second, I guess, treatment of the documentary, would be that instead of these characters being interviewed and explaining their memories or histories of the river, they would be recast as actors acting themselves along the riverbank or even on the river. So it would sort of involve working with choreographer to try and figure out how we'd articulate those stories through actions rather than through talking.
And a lot of your previous work does that with real people in their place, yeah?
Yeah. So it sort of links back to how I've tried to work before, as a way of telling a story, but they're usually much more, there hasn't been the impetus to try and collate those in a way that this format sort of tends to need to make it a documentary, I guess. Yeah. The other theme, I guess, would be this idea of the river as a life force that's generous at points, but also can be quite cruel. So one of the stories, let me think. I guess some of those manifestations would be, fishing that happens in the river in terms of its generosity, the farming that happens along the river, the Emery farm, which is opposite in terms of dairy farming, or it's Tony's Soil Co. that they produce like a organic fertiliser. In terms of the first 150 years of that farming, it being quite generous, but then falling off, the number of dairy farmers, I guess, diminishing, or at least the number of companies that are producing the milk and cream changing, and I guess it just being harder to earn a living from working the landscape around the river over time. And as a manifestation of that, turning to other industries such as tourism. Therese, who runs the houseboats a little bit further down the river, I guess is an example of a way in which the river's used, or another way in which the river's used. And when when I sat down and talked with her, she sort of took me through how she would sort of present these houseboats to tourists that were coming to take them for the weekend. And I was thinking perhaps how you would engage that performatively within the documentary. So it might be this idea that she instead choreographs kind of an introduction to the houseboat for the river, as opposed to, a kind of an introduction for tourists that would be taking the boat along the river. So that, I guess that would be one way in which the documentary deals with that in a slightly different way.
You've talked about some of the people who engage with the river on a daily or very frequent basis, and you've talked about the way that you might work with them within the documentary. What's your process of actually doing that? Do you talk with them over a period of time and then invite them to work with the choreographer, or how do you see that working?
I think it would be going back to them and saying, this is what I was thinking. What is it about your relationship to the river that you would hope that could be brought through the documentary, and then trying to find devices to do that. So sometimes they're things that I might suggest, and then that's what might happen in the end. Or other times, no, I don't like that. Why don't we try it this way? And so I guess it differs depending upon who the person is, and then yeah, I mean, in the past, I guess I've tried to do the choreography of that, and just sort of you set up a camera and test a few different things, see what works. But if there was the opportunity to work with a choreographer who had better understanding of how to, you know, because most of the people don't have experience acting, so they're
playing themselves.
Yeah, so there's often a kind of a learning process for me, but also them in terms of how that might translate for a camera, that would see it very differently. Yeah, and then sort of, I guess the other part of that is negotiating. Often the people that I work with are interested in who else is involved in the documentary, so to trying to kind of get a map of that, so that I guess that they feel comfortable about, you know, what it's saying or what it could be saying. Things come up. Yeah. So I guess another theme would be looking at some of the unique spiritualities that I guess the river has, some of the unique connections that people have with the river. So in some of the interviews, just as an example, Nicholas, who runs the wildlife park a little bit further down, it's a long story, but he came here at a time, I guess, when he was going through a change in his life. He used to be a bodybuilder and then had always worked in zoos, but came here and set up the zoo down the river. But with his mother set up a little seat on the river, which is a sort of a place where they go and reflect and sort of think about, you know, their Christian spirituality. And so trying to use him in that way and trying to film, I guess, that connection that he has. When I was interviewing Jim on the river, there was a really beautiful moment where we were in the middle of he was in the middle of answering a question, but he heard the call of a whipbird or something and sort of broke out of that mode of interview into a completely different mode where he was sort of engaging with the landscape in a very different way. So I was really interested how, I guess, Jim's formed a relationship to the river through the sounds of the birds that live in the landscape, and so trying to choreograph perhaps Jim in a way that would bring those things out through the documentary rather than just talking about them. And I guess to me that was a moment when that actually happened that can't be planned. So how do you plan something like that? And of course there's those historical ones like Arthur's connection to it, which, yes, I guess I haven't figured out how I would bring that. I don't think it would be, I'm not quite sure how yet I would bring that out. And then I guess the last one was the theme that I already mentioned, looking at the river as a leveller but also as a divider for people. So when we were, where they launched the boats, just as you come off near Nowra Bridge, every year they hold a dragon boat regatta there. I'd previously interviewed people at that same site a couple of days before at lunchtime. There were council workers that had gone down there to have their lunch, which they seem to do most days of the week, and just enjoying that very quiet area along the river there. And then a couple of days later, there was a huge regatta there with hundreds of people, and it's also used by, I guess that event's often used to try and encourage interest in that as a site for development. So one of the I think one of the women we interviewed was from the local bank there and talking about trying to attract investment for cafes and building along the river. I think a lot of people see it as a sort of a very underutilised resource, but then there of course are those other people that, you know, enjoy the river for that very same reason.